And as the night fell, the children huddled in their hiding spot under the house. They listened. Their father hadn't told them what the witch's song would sound like, only that they would hear it, and they would want to sing along.
The box was full of well-thumbed poetry books, dog-eared pages falling out of their torn bindings, notebooks bulging with addenda, and cassette tapes whose sleeves were a mess of frantic scribbles. It erupted with the dusty sense of mildew and stale sweat when Jay opened it. His dad was going to throw all of this out. Even if his dad didn't understand what he did, Jay thought at least he'd understand the value in his grandfather's writing. Poetry was more traditionally respectable than hip-hop after all. But his dad was an English teacher who understood so much about studying words and unpicking them for meaning, he didn't seem to connect that with the process of writing. Jay always felt that his dad should have admired what his grandfather did as a poet, and what he was trying to do as a writer. They were all fascinated with words. But his father always saw himself as more refined. He saw Jay's grandfather as a drunken failure, and he saw Jay as what exactly? A disappointment? He certainly didn't see the intricate wordplay of clattering consonants, concurrent rhyme schemes, barrages of imagery, and the primal thrill of improvisation. His dad just wanted to throw out this box, his grandfather's life's work. He had rarely spoken about Jay's grandfather, and they never visited. For Jay, this box now represented that visit, a chance to get to know his grandfather. He saw in this box that it was possible to spend a life writing, creating worlds, and for it to end as just a box of rubbish that wasn't even mentioned in the estate inventory, just destined for the tip. If that's where Jay's work was heading, he'd want at least one person to spend time with it. Perhaps Jay could learn something from his grandfather. The only encouragement his dad gave him was that he should spend more time studying real poetry. Well, his grandfather was a real poet, wasn't he? He never published anything, but that didn't make him any less real. Jay could do with the inspiration. His last track had just disappeared into the social media and Spotify algorithms. He'd worked so hard on that, and had hoped for some buzz or a radio station to at least repost it. He even tried to give it a poppy chorus to make it more palatable. He was frustrated that he had to make what he saw as more popular music so that people would hear it, but even that didn't work. He wanted to find his own voice, without compromise, but he didn't know how. The handwriting across the notebooks was tight and cramped. There wasn't a space on any page that wasn't filled with those frantic notations. Sometimes stanzas went sideways in the margins of other poems. It wasn't clear which were edits to the poems on the page and which were bursts of words into any available space. The pages made Jay's head spin. He could barely make out any words in that tightly scribbled cursive handwriting. There were a few tapes that, as far as he could glean from the writing on their labels, seemed to be readings of the poems. They would be a lot easier to follow. Jay had never heard his grandfather's voice. His dad's tape player was in the living room. It sat unused as a chunky box holding up the rest of the hi-fi components. The buttons were stiff and their action boomed through the casing. The tape in there was some cheap petrol station compilation of classic film themes whose spools were caught in the workings when Jay tried to take it out. It was impossible to tell if the crackling was on his grandfather's tape, the player, or just a natural feature of the archaic media. Jay listened carefully. Amongst the noise, he started to discern chatter, as if it was a recording of a busy bar. The voices overlapped, so it became one indistinct mass amongst the tape hiss. The voices and conversations did not stop when the poet started reading, very close to the microphone.
A flick it, a flack it, my tongue pandemonian. Now let the welkin ring. They're grim and bombardical, with gebrastel and crickling, forden and clattrum, let the herdum-durdum sing. A clinkum, a clackum, my tongue pandemonian. It's come, let the welkin ring.
This refrain was repeated a few times before the end of the tape. There was no applause, no ceremony. It was as if Jay's grandfather was just sitting in a busy pub by himself recording poems. He played another tape from the box. This was almost indistinguishable from the first. The same poem, read with a slightly different cadence, slightly slurred. The background chatter was perhaps more boisterous and loud. As he played through the tapes, all recordings were of the same words. He wondered if indeed his grandfather had been all that his dad had said, delusional and drunk. If his dad was right about him, was he also right about Jay? From the box, a strong smell of pipe smoke rose. It was easy to imagine that this was his grandfather's smell, that he was with him then, in what might be the last and only real engagement with his writing. Jay could imagine him looking over his shoulder, his moth-worn cardigan dangling loose threads along the nape of Jay's neck as he leaned in too close. He almost saw curls of tobacco wisp from behind him. He didn't turn around. Listening to the tapes helped Jay read through the piles of notebooks and paper scraps. Even if he didn't recognise the words in the poem, he started to see how they were written. Thumbing through pages and pages, these were the only words written, over and over. Sometimes they were in a slightly different order, sometimes spelt slightly differently. But it was all his grandfather had written. Was all of this just one poem? Is this all his grandfather had done? What did it mean? The only papers that weren't scribbled with these words, with this singular poem, was a small scrapbook of newspaper clippings. One told of a local pub that had burned down in 1973 that couldn't find a new leaseholder due to the persistent and aggressive wasp infestation. Another told of a small town's weird take on a gala parade, in which the climax was a recreation of someone being stoned to death while the townsfolk all made as much noise as they possibly could. That had been his dad's hometown. He'd never mentioned it. And Jay had certainly never heard of this happening, even though he'd lived there briefly. There was one photograph right at the bottom. It was yellowing and curled, one of its edges burned. Jay knew that it was his grandfather. The pipe smoke and frayed cardigan were exactly as he'd pictured him standing behind him. In his left hand, at an awkward downward angle, he held a cassette recorder. In his right hand, held up his elbow at a firm right angle, was a pointed stone. The stone seemed to have carvings around a central hole, which his grandfather seemed careful not to cover with his grip. Jay wondered if this was the sort of stone used in that village's gala recreation. Its formation looked so unnatural, and yet looked as if it had not been carved or chiselled either. Around his head he wore a band of twigs and knotted leaves. Despite all this garb, he looked just like Jay, just like his father. It wasn't until his friend pounding on his door made him realise that he'd missed several texts and phone calls and that he was late for soundcheck that he realised how absorbed he'd been in studying the poem. He'd completely forgotten about the show and had done nothing to prepare. He probably should have rehearsed the new single to perform, but seeing as how it had disappeared with so few streams or downloads, he could barely summon the enthusiasm for it. He knew playing it live was the best way to promote it, but seeing all of his grandfather's work, that attempt at making accessible music suddenly felt so forced and insincere. Packing his sampler, drum machine and effects rack, he grabbed an armful of the cassette tapes to take with him. He could improvise a plunderphonic set around them. The venue was cramped under a Chinese restaurant. The woman at the sound desk let him do a cursory line check before the doors opened. Jay and his friend went to the pub along the road, hoping to come back to a bustling, eager audience. 5 minutes before Jay's set, they returned and there was only a smattering of people. Some of Jay's friends and their bands, some of the regulars. There were more venue staff and servers from upstairs coming and going than there was a crowd. Still, Jay was happy to have the chance to play with his newfound sounds. Warming up with some drum loops and ambient samples, he did eventually tease what he saw as his biggest songs, hoping for a twang of recognition or excitement from the audience. but they passed without distracting anyone from their watery lagers and chats. Jay didn't want to be background music. If no one was listening anyway, he popped in one of his grandfather's tapes and fed it into his sampler, mangling the words into elongated soundscapes over the beat. No matter how he tweaked them, no matter what he paired them with, they seemed to sync, moulding the rhythm and tone to fit themselves. As he brought that improvised track to an end, the drums faded away. He let the recording of his grandfather's poem play raw, without any sonic trickery. The room changed. In the fog machine's haze, it looked like people were dancing. He didn't recognize any faces from the usual crowd. They were indistinct in their movement. The dancing bodies were like a sudden throng of ghosts. The rhythm of the words insisted themselves as a hypnotic, pummeling trance. The words no longer seemed quite so nonsensical, but spoke firmly to the primal celebrations erupting on the floor. I've got them, Jay thought, smiling, fading the poem out into a new track, pushing the BPM higher. But the venue was empty. There was no one dancing. It was just wishful thinking manifested as a momentary, ludicrous vision. Jay's frantic beats became ridiculous on the quiet stage. He botched the tempo's shift back into ambience in his confusion, but no one noticed or cared. They were waiting for the headliner. He slipped on another one of the tapes. Again, the room shifted immediately. Even without any drums or synths or anything Jay had traditionally associated with dance, the poem brought those misty wraiths to the floor. He wondered if this was a vision his grandfather had shared when reading the poem to an oblivious or uncaring bar all those years ago.
Flack it, my tongue pandemonian. Now let the welkin ring. Their grim and bombardical, with and crickling, forged and clattrum, let the herdum sing. A clinkum, a clackum, my tongue pandemonian. It's come, let the welkin ring.
While this was playing, Jay pulled out another tape player to experiment layering it up with some of the other recordings. The dance grew more intense. Limbs flailed. Everywhere he looked, these hauntings were sweating and red-eyed. Some were naked. Multiple readings of the poem started to complement each other, giving counterbeats and creating the illusion of a full, rounded sound. With two tape players and the sampler now loaded with his grandfather's words, he didn't need to stop. There was nothing else he needed. Those rare drum breaks or horn loops he'd spent so many hours digging through charity shop crates for were redundant. This was the song. He learned its ways by playing. The recordings were not all the same. Every reading, every slightly different tone or pause in the words created a different whirlpool in the pit. The people, still just a blur of unrecognised faces, must have been growing dehydrated and exhausted, but did not stop their frenzy of spinning and swinging steps. It was intoxicating. Jay would never need another sound. He was probably losing it, seeing things. He was sure that his friends would complain about the shoddy set and him running over time, that he looked ridiculous getting really into playing some weird spoken word as if it was the most banging beats. Perhaps, but he had found his voice. As he played, he caught the whiff of pipe smoke from over his shoulder and the fraying threads of the cardigan as someone reached over and placed something in his hand. A small, chiselled, sharp stone with a hole through it, red spiral lines emanating from its centre. Testing the stone in his hand, he traced the spiral blood grooves with his eyes. He knew that he had to play this too. He placed the rock on the turntable. The stylus also seemed transformed by the sound and glistened hungrily. A drop of fertile sap hung from its blade-like stinger as he dropped it down. It was time to complete the song. Caledonian Gothic presents 6 songs folk historians don't want you to hear. This melody will shock you. Written and produced by Maloney. Sound design and audio mix by Gareth. Theme tune by Devereux of Tin Can Audio. Also featuring the voices of Rhiannon Grist, Allison, Josh Holton, Sandra Spighel, Bram Gieben and Gavin Inglis. Broadcast signal intrusion by Alistair Rennie. Original development was done with funding and support from Creative Scotland and Playwrights Studio Scotland. See the show notes for further info, including links to transcripts. Please do like, share, review, and let us know what you thought. Completely and proudly human-made. Thank you for listening.